So I can't tell you how daunting it is being asked to give an inspirational talk, and you start to reflect on, whether that's you, whether you're the right person. And then I think this kind of underpins it for me, the fact that I am supported by the NIHR. And actually, I've been supported by the NIHR continuously since 2011 now. And so I feel like I do have a few top tips up my sleeve that should help you with both this boot camp, but also beyond. And hopefully some lessons that I've learned along the way that can help you to think about your next steps. And for kind of a lot of those reasons, I've called this Plan A and the bumps along the road, because I certainly think that even as the inspirational speaker today, it's really important to give you a realistic insight into the fact that it's not all plain sailing, and that perhaps what you see and what that very generous introduction, not written by me, I have to say, so thank you to probably Vicky Goodwin, who put pen to paper with that one, has attested to certainly my grant success and the fact that I am involved with National Leadership of Ageing, and I'm very proud to do that. But certainly along the way, that doesn't mean that I've got every grant I've ever written, and it doesn't mean that you always feel on top of your game. So here's my story, and hopefully some lessons for you as well. So just to give some background, so I am a clinical academic, but like I said, there are lots of very transferable skills and transferable lessons to those of you that are non-clinical researchers by background, but also across different clinical walks of life. So as a research interested trainee initially, and then my journey through, I became an NIHR academic clinical fellow, which is the pre-doctoral phase for doctors in training, and then an NIHR doctoral fellowship award holder, followed by an NIHR development and skills enhancement award, and then a clinical lecturer award, and now, as the introduction said, I've got an NIHR advanced fellowship, and I'm a consultant geriatrician. So that's the kind of headlines of what's happened since 2011, and during that pathway of being funded for my research by the NIHR. And guess what you see as part of that is this grant success and collaboration and the dissemination and the bits that we share, those kind of tips that we share on social media, and those external perceptions of us that we want other people to see. But it's a little bit like taking a photograph of your kitchen once it's been fully cleaned and posting that on social media, as people do, and there might be a little pile of crockery waiting to be washed in the sink, or there might be something to the back of the camera that you've quickly swept off stage. There are other parts to this story. So the other things that we talk about highly in our external presence and in our personal branding are our team, our ideas, and also it's also underpinned, and the kind of trees in this analogy, your expertise and also the foundations of your institution, or the other support structures that you've got in your institution, or your biomedical research centre perhaps, or also I heard people talking about the ARCs earlier. So all of these fantastic opportunities and people and places that support the work that we do. But underlying that is the hard work that we've been doing to support our careers, to think about the ideas that underpin the difficult science that we're working with. In my field of ageing, there are so many research questions to be answered, and it's working your way through what's actually a tangible research question that can be answered with either the data we've got, the resources we've got, the recruitment processes we've got, how you can put together a team with the right expertise and credentials, and I'll come back to that can help to make those grant bids a success. And so all of that hard work for me is the sort of roots beneath the trees, the bit you don't necessarily see, that crockery in the sink, that can help to build this picture of success. And then also the other bit that I don't think gets, is difficult to tell the story of, the things that don't go on your CV that you might have put loads of work into along the way, those grants that you've written or have got near to completion of submission that for some reason haven't either been funded or been successful, or even perhaps been submitted in the end, and perhaps the things that haven't worked out. I was on the Aging Clinical Research Network meeting earlier, and we were talking exactly about that, about, a trial. It wasn't my trial, but it was a trial that I was aiming to recruit to, and how sometimes even when the pillars are in place to be set up for success, and you think it's a great research question and a great potential trial, there's something that means that recruitment fails, or that it stalls at some point along the line. And so I thought it was important to include in this just a little bit more about that story along the way, all those efforts that I've put in that aren't reflected on my CV. So this is the sort of traditional slide of the clinical academic pathway, and I know that won't apply to all of you, but it's just to kind of explain to you exactly what I've done. So at medical, I graduated in 2007, and back then the pathways were a bit different, and now I know lots of people are doing PhDs that are as part even of their medical school experience as doctors, and I think that's really great, but we've got to flex our system as well to understand, and along with allied health professionals as well, and non-clinicians, that actually the career pathway does take different twists and turns, and people will do their PhD at different times in their career pathway. My personal journey, I did my undergraduate at medical school. I went through the foundation programme, so that's the first 2 years as a doctor, and then I did the core training as well. And during that time, I accrued research skills and experience, but I only became a research trainee in my registrar years, and then went out to do my PhD during that time, came back into research training as a registrar as well, and now I'm a consultant with a senior clinical fellowship. So I thought it might be useful to just talk about what had happened along that way. So certainly as a research interested trainee before my PhD, and I know that the majority of you will already be at that doctoral or postdoctoral phase to be on this boot camp. But along that course, you will have been building your CV, thinking about opportunities. You'll probably already have got some established mentors. And if you don't have that, then it would be something that I'd encourage you to do. Certainly having wisdom and guidance across different groups of people. So for me, that's I do have a separate clinical mentor from a research mentor, and even someone else that I lean on more for advice about perhaps career and next steps with career versus my academic or my clinical roles as well. And then the ideas generation really happened for me at that pre-doctoral phase, and obviously throughout I've not stopped thinking of ideas, but my research now is still based on those early ideas that I've had, and I've carried on to build and continue in a theme of cardiovascular frailty. And that's led me to really develop my enthusiasm along the way, because these aren't ideas that I've been given by other people or that I've applied into a specific grant. It's things that have really grown from a seed that I had originally. And then I've obviously evolved it with the evidence base evolving, and also with different people that I've worked with along the way to build it into what it is today, but also hopefully to lean forward into a future career that will also align with that platform that I've built myself already and the established research that I've done. As my pre-doctoral phase as well, I was building broad research interests and doing research training and acquiring formal skills as well. And this is when the first sort of bump in the road bit comes in. So for my, I think it's important to think about who the funder is and targeting the funder for the research idea that you've got. And that can really help to reduce that wastage that you might get. And the right funder for your research might not always be the NIHR. And so thinking about whether your research fits in with the funder's aims and scope and strategic direction as well. So for me, my research was more NIHR orientated, and so that was part of the kind of bumps in the road. Was really actually I ended up going to Welcome into the MRC with a very similar proposal, And had I had the wisdom at that point to understand what the different funders were looking for, I would have understood better that perhaps my research and my research goals, that I was lucky enough to get interviews with those two funders, but actually it didn't really fit with what their remit was. And so, sorry, the bump ahead. And so it was good to get funded by the NIHR, but I think also they were the right funder. And this is where also mentorship and guidance from either supervisors when you're at the doctoral phase, but also other collaborators can be really useful along the way. Now, I then went off between the failed MRC interview and my NIHR interview. I had my first maternity leave at that point, and that was really hard because I came back from maternity leave still without a funded PhD. And I was feeling at that point, a bit despondent. And, was this research world for me? I'd seen clinical colleagues already moving on with their careers, and you watch people sort of outpace you in a way. And that can be really tricky. And you have to be really resilient and motivated to stick with it. And what I found actually was that during that maternity leave, the data had moved on to a point where I was able to be more persuasive also with that NIHR bid. So it was the right funder, but it was also, I had more pilot work and I was able to be more persuasive in the way that I wrote that grant then, and to work up a more meaningful grant proposal, which led to ultimately to successful funding. And one of the things I wanted to say was that there may not be the perfect time. So, was this point in my life when I was also on maternity leave and I didn't work while I was on maternity leave at all. I was very boundaried about it. And I think that's absolutely right. If you're on any sort of parental leave or sick leave or annual leave, I feel strongly that shouldn't be a time when you work. I know that we all go above and beyond for this job. I know that that our research is really important, but I also think that it's important to be boundaried about life as well. So I was worried that this opportunity would pass me by, but actually, there may not be the perfect time for you to put in these grants, and so sometimes it's about getting on with it and delivering so that it's not part of that ultimate wastage and so that you give yourself the best opportunity. But also, if you are at that point where, for example, you may be going on parental leave, to talk to your colleagues about still being a collaborator on those grants going forward, still wanting to be part of the research in those phases when you return. So this is, these were my bumps in the road. I didn't just have the one maternity leave. I had 3 maternity leaves and the third was twins. And actually each time I was in a fortunate position when I came back from the maternity leave to be able to progress that research. And so I think that's kind of part of why I've been asked to tell my story today as well, that actually I also believe that it's possible to thrive in research alongside having a family. And I think that you learn to, work efficiently, work smart, but also I think I'm more motivated than ever actually to and enthused for my research. The only problem was that along the time of having those maternity leaves, I did experience a confidence dip. I did experience on return to work each time that uncertainty if this was the right path or not. And like I said, I was being slightly lapped by my clinical colleagues who not only had I gone out of these maternity leaves, but I'd also was doing a PhD, which made me feel somewhat behind, because people who are several years behind you, who you've trained, start to become consultants ahead of you. And that can feel, for those of us who are competitive about our careers and who are driven to succeed, can almost feel like you're falling behind, even though that's obviously a false perception. And of course, the research keeps moving forward. So I completed my PhD, and that was at exactly the time that the pandemic hit. So it was a really busy time, but also an opportunity and a time where I was able to thrive and make the most of opportunities in research leadership. And I don't know, I feel like it was a time also where I learned to be super efficient and was quite prolific in my ability to write grants at that time. I think it really sparked that sort of scientific creativity. and that sort of, hey, do you know, if we can get through this, we can do anything. We can, you know, let's work together, let's collaborate, and we can build that really great science in different fields. And as I said at the beginning, I work in aging and multiple long-term conditions, and I know that Professor Lucy Chappell's speaking to you afterwards, and she, as she said in one of her talks, you know, taking things out of the too difficult box, and that was her line on multiple long-term conditions. And I think this is really important. You know, we are the scientists of the future. We can do this hard science, but it's got to be top quality to get that research funding. And I would say that, so in striving for perfection, because we're really trying to get these excellent quality grants, we can achieve excellence. So I do think that, you know, by trying to be as good as we can, you know, we can get it a really good quality grant. Also, that a grant doesn't have to be and can't be as perfect as you'd want it to put it into a funder. You have to be able to recognise the limitations of either the data that you've got, your skills, you know, whatever the limitations might be, but label them within your grant application. Make sure that it's very clear that you recognise those limitations and how you are going to achieve the grant despite that. So what that might look like is what your training program is, or bringing in a collaborator who's got that skill set that perhaps you are deficient in or don't have yet. Talk a lot in grant preparation about project, person and place, and these are obviously fundamentals. But I just wanted to say a little bit more about what I think the important aspects are in threading that into the grant, because it can be a bit nebulous. So I think it's really important in grants to be authentic. I described the story of coming up with essentially the research that I wanted to grow and build over time quite early on in my research career as a pre-doctoral phase. And I really have built on that over time. And every time I go back to my clinical job in front door frailty and see people that have fallen over and look at their blood pressures and look at their physiology and hear their stories, most importantly. And I know the speaker before was talking about PPIE, but it's so important to get patient and public voices into this research world. But I think that you know, what that gives me is this authenticity in my research. And so when I speak about it, to be persuasive in grant writing is actually more straightforward, because it's a concept that I've developed over time, certainly with collaboration, certainly with patient voices, but it's led me to be able to be more authentic in the way that I write. Credibility. So do you have the skill set that matches the grant that you're writing? Or, as I said before, can you bring in other collaborators? And how do you show that credibility? So I've also worked as a reviewer for the NIHR, and you can see some grants, and then you look at the list of people involved, and you think, well, actually, they do have the credentials, but they've not necessarily been persuasive in their writing about those credentials. And so I think it is really important to let that credibility and why you're the right person or the right team to deliver on this grant come through in your grant writing. And, you know, that whole analogy of the tree, so let this bit shine in your personal brand and in the way that you're communicating for your grant writing. Let this bit of, you know, excellence in your team, your environment, the ARC, the BRC, whoever it is that supports you, really shine through. Talk about the excellence that you've had in your dissemination and, you know, your creativity, your ideas. And obviously you don't mention so much of what we described as the wastage and the work that you've been doing to date. But those bits can really shine through. This is your opportunity to tell people and brag about what you've done. I've mentioned already a couple of times persuasion, but for me, this is the fourth P. You need to be persuasive in your grant writing to be successful. In terms of that, what are the key messages? So if you're going to be persuading different people to fund your research, and you know, what would the key message be? What would it be if you're talking to the leader of your research group? What would it be if you're talking to the lead of the NIHR? If you had 2 minutes with them, what would you say? What is the key message? What's the bottom line? What would you say if you were talking to someone in your family, your parents, your children, whoever it is that this research is more likely to apply to? And can you say that succinctly and then try and get it across in your grant? And then the so what. This is such an important part of grant writing. So what is for NIHR particularly, what is the potential pathway to impact, even if your research might be more mechanistic at this point? So for me in multiple long-term conditions, some of my research is very mechanistic. It's looking at the genetics of the overlapping conditions, but actually ultimately I can see that affecting change with both prevention and treatment in a more holistic way to prevent multiple long-term conditions in people as they age. And that's so important. And I can see that pathway, but you need to be persuasive of that in your grant writing. And the final thing that I wanted to say was that no plan ever went exactly to plan. So make sure that your plan B is exceptional. So with my NIHR Advanced Fellowship, it took me a year from submission through to hearing. Whether I was successful or not. And so in that time, I was a senior registrar. I was just about to find out about being a consultant, but the NIHR fellowship was a key part of that time. And so what could I do to make sure that I had a plan B that was exciting? And so I thought about the potential of going away, of taking some time to do something really dynamic and slightly different. You can't always make those radical changes, but perhaps you can make dreams about them. And sometimes having a plan B that's quite exciting can help plan A, or the wait for plan A, to know if it's happening or not, a bit more bearable. So thank you so much for having me to talk today. I hope that some of those elements were both practical, useful, and that journey of having long-term funding from the NIHR, like I said, back from 2011, can offer some inspiration, but also that you can overcome those bumps in the road along the way, and that you can, thrive and continue in research alongside a family as well. And I'm happy to take any questions. I'm not sure if there's time to do it now or whether to delay it to the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.